When the end finally came, it did so with remarkable swiftness. Prior to mid-February, the Donbass town of Avdiivka had been holding out against Russian forces for nearly a decade. Surrounded on three sides since 2014, it acted as a key Ukrainian fortress, allowing Kiev's troops to disrupt Moscow's supply lines and shell the occupied city of Donetsk. As recently as December, it was still holding firm against Russian attacks, a heavily fortified symbol of Ukrainian resistance. But then Moscow's forces managed to breach the first line of defenses, and the rest quickly crumbled. As Ukraine's new commander, Colonel General Alexander Syrsky, was appointed on the 8th of February, the situation was beginning to look critical. By February the 16th, social media was alive with reports that Russia was about to encircle Avdiivka's defenders. Then, on February the 17th, Syrsky announced he'd given the order to withdraw. After holding out for nearly 10 years, Avdiivka, at last, had fallen. In the days since, you've probably heard a lot about this latest setback for Ukraine's forces, about how Avdiivka's conquest marks Russia's biggest victory since taking Bakhmut in May of 2023, about how it's a loss far more consequential to Ukraine than Bakhmut ever was. As the New York Times put it, Avdiivka was a stronghold of Ukrainian defenses in the Donetsk region, protecting several key Ukrainian military positions farther west. Among those positions is the strategic city of Pokrovsk, a place vital for Ukrainian logistics and one Russia will likely now turn its attention to. The silver lining to this cloud of disappointment was that things initially appeared to be much worse. The social media chatter about encircled Ukrainian troops, with a few days hindsight, it looks like this came perilously close to happening. That Kiev's forces instead managed to retreat in good order should make everyone breathe a sigh of relief. As analyst John Helen noted on X, encircled Ukrainians and mass POWs would have been catastrophic for Ukraine politically and militarily. That this didn't happen is due to good choices made by commanding officers, not least the choice to sacrifice the city to save lives. As The Economist noted, they could have instead opted to stage last stand at the sprawling, defensible coke plants on the edge of town in a rerun of what happened at Mariupol's iron and steel works. That they didn't has preserved crucial manpower. Also in the silver linings category, it was the sheer number of casualties the Kremlin's forces took. Since the main assault on Avdiivka began in October, Ukraine estimates 17,000 Russians were killed and 30,000 were wounded. Russian telegram channels, meanwhile, claimed the true figure was more like 16,000 killed and wounded. Regardless of who is close to the real figure, that is still a staggering amount. At the higher end, it would mean more Russians died taking one Donbass town this winter than officially died in the entire 10-year Soviet-Afghan war. Still, let's not kid ourselves. While it could have gone much worse, the fall of Avdiivka marks a bleak moment for Ukraine, one in which, for perhaps the first time since the spring of 2022, it looks like Kiev might really lose the war. Now, we'll come on to the likelihood of that later in today's video. For now, though, we need to answer two key questions. One, how did this happen? And two, what comes next? The first question's complicated. It involves both local and international factors. From a purely military standpoint, though, a whole lot of blame can be heaped on the shortages that Ukraine is currently experiencing. Where artillery is concerned, these shortages have become dangerous. After briefly achieving near parity at some sections of the front over the summer, Kiev has since seen its ability to match Russian shelling dwindle. Even in the winter, Ukraine managed to hold Avdiivka as Moscow's forces gained a 5-1 artillery advantage. By the time the city fell, that advantage had grown to 10-1. Among Ukrainian lines, shell rationing had become acute. The Wall Street Journal reported that, quote, soldiers sometimes hold fire even when Russian soldiers are in their sights in order to preserve ammunition. If artillery shortages had become acute, though, then air defense missile shortages were critical. The last days before Avdiivka's fall were characterized by Russian airstrikes and an intensity not yet seen in the conflict. The Institute for the Study of War reports that on February the 14th alone, Russia conducted 73 airstrikes in the area. Glide bombs, too, played their part. With around 60 deployed a day from great distances, they annihilated Ukrainian positions. Overall, it's thought that between January the 1st and February the 17th, Russian forces dropped something in the region of 450,000 kilograms of bombs on an area about 1/10 the size of Washington, D.C. That this was possible was due to extremely overstretched Ukrainian air defenses being unable to cover the whole front. With adequate defenses missing around Avdiivka, the ISW claims Russian forces, quote, temporarily established limited and localized air superiority and were able to provide ground troops with close air support. Now, Providing ground troops with close air support is exactly what a half-decent military is meant to do. Prior to the fall of Avdiivka, though, Ukrainian air defenses were too strong to allow Moscow this luxury. With clear gaps now emerging in those defenses, there's a decent chance that such relentless bombing campaigns could become a feature of the war. The ISW estimates that if shortages continue, then Russia may be able to establish temporary, localized air superiority along more parts of the front. If the shortages get worse, the Russians may begin massive air campaigns that unleash levels of destruction similar to the Kremlin's air war in Syria. And this is not a hypothetical possibility, it is a real one. Speaking anonymously to the New York Times, American officials have indicated that, without further donations from the West, Ukraine's air defense missile stocks will run dry in March of 2024. Thankfully, we're not there yet. In the aftermath of the retreat from Avdiivka, Kiev's forces managed to shoot down 4 Sukhoi Su-34 fighter bombers and 2 Sukhoi Su-35s, a clear signal that Russia does not yet control the skies. But the growing shortages of artillery shells and air defense missiles do point to another factor behind the fall of Avdiivka: the failure of the West to get its collective together. The failure flows from both sides of the Atlantic. In Europe, a pledge made in 2023 to supply Ukraine with 1 million shells by March this year instead resulted in a mere 524,000 shells being delivered. In America, meanwhile, a vital aid package has been stalled in Congress since autumn. In Europe's case, the failure is due to an unwillingness to move the continent's defense industries onto a war footing. As soon as it became clear that his initial plan of conquest had failed, Putin began mobilizing Russia for a long war. Most of Europe, by contrast, sat around with its thumb up its bottom, failing to act with any sense of urgency. When the million shells announcement was made in early 2023, the EU, bowing to French pressure, insisted those shells must be locally made. But without any earlier efforts to boost European production, the homegrown clause simply meant the bloc failed to meet its target. The good news is that investments made over the last year suggest Europe will be producing way over 1 million shells in 2025. The bad news is that 2025 is a hell of a long way away when Ukraine desperately needs shells right now. If the story in Europe is one of idleness and poorly managed industrial policy, then the story in the US is one that will be familiar to all our American viewers: endless partisan gridlock. Although a $60 billion aid package for Ukraine was put forward back in autumn, wrangling over new restrictions on the southern US border delayed a vote until this year, when Senate leadership at last split the aid off from immigration reform. But while Ukraine aid, along with aid to Israel and Taiwan, cleared the Senate by 70 votes to 29, it's now languishing in the House, where Speaker Mike Johnson is said to have privately told Republicans there is, quote, no rush to address the issue. It really seems he means it. At the time of writing, the House is on a 2-week recess. Weirdly for non-Americans, there nonetheless seems to be a majority in the House for passing the aid package in a bipartisan vote. Even weirder, Pew Research published this February shows 74% of Americans describe the war in Ukraine as important to the national interest, a figure that includes 69% of Republicans and Republican-leaning independents. Unfortunately, that figure doesn't include the small number of hard-right House members who would kick Mike Johnson out of the Speaker's chair if he sent so much as another penny to Kyiv. And so the bill continues to languish, even as vital Ukrainian capabilities run low. Still, while Ukraine's backers in the West have to take some blame for the fall of Avdiivka, Kyiv itself is not wholly innocent. While Ukraine cannot solve the air defense or shell hunger problem by itself, it could solve the crucial manpower one. On Telegram, serving soldiers have been open about the shortage of troops, the lack of rotation on the front line, and the fact that many of those fighting fall into the 40 to 45 age bracket, an age at which the sheer physical strain of fighting takes a serious toll. The military believes such pressures could be alleviated by mobilizing an additional 500,000 troops. The trouble is that authorizing a mass mobilization like this would be so unpopular that none of Ukraine's politicians are willing to do it. And to be fair to them, there are good reasons. Plucking another 500,000 men out of the workforce would further damage an economy that's badly contracting. Suggestions that younger men should be mobilized also run into the problem of Ukraine's unusual demographics, in which those fighting in the age cohort of 18 to 25 are in the shortest supply. As a result of people foregoing kids during the deep economic depression of the 1990s, this relative lack of young people also means Ukraine can't afford to lose too many without sacrificing its own future. The flip side, of course, is that there won't be any future if Russia wins this war, but with the mobilization debate so polarizing, politicians have not yet pressed ahead with legislation. Taken together, these European, American, and Ukrainian failures explain why the outlook for the next few months is so bleak. To return to our second question from several minutes ago, what comes next? The answer appears to be anything from a bad spring to a really bad one. At the worst end of the spectrum, you have predictions made by guys like analyst Rob Lee, who notes that the meager gains Ukraine made in its counteroffensive last summer are hard to defend and likely to come under threat. Already Russia is attacking around Robotyne, and it could be that Ukrainian forces will be rolled back from there. Similarly, analyst John Helen thinks Avdiivka could just be the start of a tsunami of bad news. In his words, Avdiivka is likely going to be a sign of things to come for this spring. Russia will attempt to push its advantage while Ukrainian troops are battered, exhausted, and lacking firepower. At the less bad end of the spectrum, you have the analysts who note that while things are not great, they could also be a whole lot worse. Given the scale of Russian losses around Avdiivka, the more optimistic have been suggesting that Moscow's troops may not be ready to fully exploit Ukraine's weaknesses. Reporting from the Munich Security Conference, the economist Shashank Doshi wrote on X, "Most officials I spoke to in Munich agreed Russia did not have capacity to achieve a major breakthrough, though they expected more incremental gains." In this, he's backed up by the British Ministry of Defence, which put out its own assessment saying that, quote, "It is likely that Russian forces lack the combat effectiveness to immediately exploit the capture of Avdiivka and will require a period of rest and refit." Indeed, the widespread assumption seems to be that Ukraine will likely lose more territory in the coming months, but that the losses will be localized, like at Avdiivka, rather than sweeping. Bad as this situation is, even the more pessimistic John Helen suggested the Ukrainians could at least try to, quote, "weather the spring storm and trick the Russians the best they can." The unspoken assumption, of course, is that the West will eventually get its act together and come to Ukraine's aid. That Ukraine will also pass its mobilization bill and get fresh troops on the front lines by summer. While both of these things are likely to happen, they're not certain. If they don't come to pass, then that spring storm is going to grow into a Category 5 hurricane, one that will scatter and destroy all possible hopes of Ukrainian victory. But we don't want to end this video on a note of relentless bleakness. Instead, we thought we could use the time we have left for something more productive, discussing the concrete, practical steps Ukraine and its allies can take to regain the initiative. The first big one is for Europe to give up its insistence on shipping homegrown shells to Ukraine and start looking beyond its borders for supplies. This is eminently doable. On the same day Avdiivka fell, Czech President Petr Pavel revealed that Prague's agents had identified 800,000 artillery shells in various foreign nations that could be bought and shipped to Ukraine within weeks. Although reporting has been hazy on where exactly these shells are, the assumption seems to be that they're spread across nations like South Korea, Turkey, and South Africa. Location aside, we know they comprise about 500,000 155mm shells and over 300,000 122mm shells. Being a small country, the Czech Republic alone can't buy and ship all of this ammo to Ukraine. But if a richer nation, like the US, the UK, or Norway, is willing to step up, then the shell hunger problem could be solved by Easter. Not my adopted home nation is the only European country thinking outside the box. On February the 19th, Denmark announced that it would donate all of its artillery to Ukraine. In making her announcement, Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen tried to cajole other states into following suit, saying, "This is not just a question about production, because we have weapons, we have ammunition, we have our defenses that we don't have to use at the moment, that we should deliver to Ukraine. We have to do more." At the time of writing, no other country has followed Denmark's lead, but the gesture shows there are artillery shells out there in the world that can still be delivered to help Kyiv withstand the onslaught. Sticking with Europe, a second thing the continent could do is boost its funding for Ukraine. In terms of non-military financial aid, the EU is by far the largest donor to Ukraine, outstripping the US by tens of billions of dollars. So it might seem a little screwy to say that Europeans should pay more. But as The Economist notes, Europe is a rich place. A rich place that claims Ukraine losing the war on its doorstep would represent an existential threat. So maybe it's time to start putting in the serious money that such a threat requires. This wouldn't even have to be a large financial burden. Estonia's Prime Minister Kaja Kallas has suggested each country in NATO donate 0.25% of their GDP to Ukraine this year. If that sounds like a lot, well, most European countries already spend 3 times that much on overseas development aid. Diverting just a third of that aid money would create a fund for Ukraine of about $150 billion, far larger than the package stuck in US Congress. At that level, Ukraine could not only keep its battered economy ticking over, it could also outright buy the air defense missiles that it needs from America. Alternatively, the EU could do what it did during the pandemic and issue joint bonds to quickly raise cash. Kaja Kallas of Estonia estimates that over 100 billion euros could be freed up in this way. Obviously, all this is easier said than done. Making any of these things happen would require overcoming Europe's institutional inertia and bridging the gap between countries, like Estonia and France, that think this is a good idea, and those, like Germany, that don't. The key point, though, is that Europe has done this sort of thing before. The energy crisis last winter and the pandemic saw both the continent pulling together in ways that previously didn't seem possible. With enough urgency and political commitment, it could be done. And speaking of urgency, the third major step would be to finally get the US aid bill through the House of Representatives. With the two parties so bitterly divided, this might seem impossible. But you can imagine a world in which Mike Johnson is at least persuaded to bring it to a vote. Maybe Biden calls him in and makes significant concessions on the border issue. Maybe the murder of Alexei Navalny convinces the speaker that the time for delays is at last over. Alternatively, maybe there's a discharge petition, a procedure that allows the House to force a floor vote on an issue against the Speaker's wishes. The catch is that it requires the signatures of 218 representatives. That would mean all Democrats agreeing and several Republicans joining them. A potentially tricky thing to ask when multiple Democrats have said that they would vote against the bill over the $14.1 billion of aid that it earmarks for Israel. But, tricky is not a synonym for impossible. And if Democrats really believe their president when he says Putin, quote, must be stopped, then this is the time to step up. The final step is for Ukraine to at last pass its mobilization bill. Make no mistake, this will be hugely unpopular in Ukraine, as mobilizations always are. It will wrench fathers away from children, husbands from wives, sons from their parents. It will result in thousands of young men who would otherwise live boring, happy, ordinary lives, dying in trenches in their country's east, cold and far from home. Sadly, though, it will be a necessary evil. Some sectors of the front have seen no troop rotations since the war began. Ukraine's defenders are exhausted. They are in need of rest. Even if the bill is passed today, it will take at least 2 months before the fresh troops reach the front. And time, sadly, is a luxury Ukraine does not have. So at the end of this video, then, we must do so with a clear message that any notion Ukraine is doomed only makes sense if the West sits back and does nothing. If America drifts into isolationism and Europe descends into bickering and paralysis. If our leaders choose to do nothing simply because doing something might be hard. Because, do make no mistake, whether Ukraine wins or loses this war is a choice. Combined, the GDP of NATO countries dwarfs that of Russia. The population of Europe alone far exceeds the manpower at Putin's disposal. In technology and expertise too, the West is light years ahead. While the Kremlin had the head start in building industrial capacity, it is not an insurmountable lead. With decisive action, plus an absolute ton of money, our collective nations could not just catch up, but go breezing past Russia. Maybe not in time to make 2024 any easier, but in time to make sure that 2025 becomes a nightmare for Moscow. So, to return to the question hanging over all of this, is Ukraine doomed? The answer's yeah, maybe, but only if we allow it to happen. Only if we, in the West, collectively choose to hand Putin a victory that we could easily deny him. It may be hard, it may be expensive, but if our leaders commit to it, they could yet ensure Russian defeat in Ukraine. The only question is, do they have the guts to do so?